There's a new conversation going on.
It calls for new innovative ideas and creativity.
It's positive.
It's a way of looking at every challenge as an opportunity.
It's about the future.
It's that unlocking that first step of creativity.
It's about what's possible.
Global challenges. A new generation. The power of imagination. Imagine it.
I have a question for you. Do you think the future's going to be what you think it's going to be?
The future is going to be good. Yeah, of course.
It might be crowded.
Green trees everywhere.
I want the whole world to be united. You don't know what's going to happen in the future, so you might want to think about it a little bit.
Creativity, technology, education, globalization, political will, personal desire, intersecting at a moment in time unlike any other, right here, right now.
I had a great story recently, I love telling it, of a little girl who was in a drawing lesson. She was 6 and she was at the back drawing, and the teacher said this little girl hardly ever paid attention, and in this drawing lesson she did. And the teacher was fascinated. She went over to her and she said, "What are you drawing?" And the girl said, "I'm drawing a picture of God." And the teacher said, "But nobody knows what God looks like." And the girl said, "They will in a minute." When my son was 4 in England, actually he was 4 everywhere, to be honest. I mean, if we're being strict about it, wherever he went, he was 4 that year. But he was in the Nativity play. Do you remember the story? No, it was big. It was a big story. Mel Gibson did the sequel. You may have seen it. I don't know. It was Nativity 2. But James got the part of Joseph, which we were thrilled about. We consider this to be one of the lead parts. We had the place crammed full of agents and T-shirts, you know. James Robinson is Joseph. He didn't have to speak, but do you know the bit where the 3 kings come in? They come in bearing gifts, and they bring gold, frankincense, and myrrh. This really happened. We're sitting there, and they, I think, just went out of sequence. Because we talked to the little boy afterwards and said, you know, "Are you okay with that?" And they said, "Yeah, why was that wrong?" They just switched. I think that was it. Anyway, the 3 boys came in, little 4-year-olds with tea towels on their heads, and they put these boxes down. The first boy said, "I bring you gold." And the second boy said, "I bring you myrrh." And the third boy said, "Frank sent this." What these things have in common, you see, is that kids will take a chance. You know, if they don't know, they'll have a go. Am I right? They're not frightened of being wrong. Now, I don't mean to say that being wrong is the same thing as being creative. What we do know is, if you're not prepared to be wrong, you'll never come up with anything original. Our education system is predicated on the idea of academic ability. And there's a reason. The whole system was invented around the world. There were no public systems of education really before the 19th century. They all came into being to meet the needs of industrialism. So the hierarchy is rooted on 2 ideas. Number one, that the most useful subjects for work are at the top. So you were probably steered benignly away from things at school when you were a kid, things you liked, on the grounds you would never get a job doing that. Is that right? Don't do music, you're not going to be a musician. Don't do art, you won't be an artist. Benign advice. Now, profoundly mistaken. The whole world is engulfed in a revolution. And the second is academic ability, which has really come to dominate our view of intelligence because the universities designed the system in their image. If you think of it, the whole system of public education around the world is a protracted process of university entrance. And the consequence is that many highly talented, brilliant, creative people think they're not. Because the thing they were good at school wasn't valued or was actually stigmatized. And I think we can't afford to go on that way. In the next 30 years, according to UNESCO, more people worldwide will be graduating through education than since the beginning of history. More people. And it's the combination of all the things we've talked about, technology and its transformational effect on work, and demography and the huge explosion in population. Suddenly, degrees aren't worth anything. Isn't that true? When I was a student, if you had a degree, you had a job. If you didn't have a job, it's because you didn't want one. And I didn't want one, frankly. So, but now, kids with degrees are often heading home to carry on playing video games. because you need an MA, where the previous job required a BA, and now you need a PhD for the other. It's a process of academic inflation, and it indicates the whole structure of education is shifting beneath our feet. We need to radically rethink our view of intelligence. We know three things about intelligence. One, it's diverse. We think about the world in all the ways that we experience it. We think visually, we think in sound, we think kinesthetically, we think in abstract terms, we think in movement. Secondly, intelligence is dynamic. If you look at the interactions of a human brain, as we heard yesterday from a number of presentations, intelligence is wonderfully interactive. The brain isn't divided into compartments. In fact, creativity, which I define as the process of having original ideas that have value, more often than not, comes about through the interaction of different disciplinary ways of seeing things. The brain is intentionally... By the way, there's a shaft of nerves that joins the two halves of the brain called the corpus callosum. It's thicker in women. Following on from Helen yesterday, I think this is probably why women are better at multitasking. Because you are. Aren't you? There's a raft of research, but I know it from my personal life. If my wife is cooking a meal at home, which is not often, thankfully, but, you know, if she's doing... No, she's good at some things. But if she's cooking, you know, she's dealing with people on the phone, she's talking to the kids, she's painting the ceiling, you know, she's doing open heart surgery over here. If I'm cooking, the door is shut, the kids are out, the phone's on the hook. If she comes in, I get annoyed. I say, Terry, please, I'm trying to fry an egg in here. You know, give me a break. Actually, there was, do you know that old philosophical thing? If a tree falls in a forest and nobody hears it, did it happen? Remember that old chestnut? I saw a great T-shirt, really, recently, which said, if a man speaks his mind in a forest and no woman hears him, is he still wrong? And the third thing about intelligence is it's distinct. I'm doing a new book at the moment called Epiphany, which is based on a series of interviews with people about how they discovered their talent. I'm fascinated by how people got to be there. It's really prompted by a conversation I had with a wonderful woman who most people have never heard of. She's called Gillian Lynn. Have you heard of her? Some have. She's a choreographer, and everybody knows her work. She did Cats and Phantom of the Opera. She's wonderful. I used to be on the board of the Royal Ballet in England, as you can see. And anyway, Gillian and I had lunch one day. I said, how'd you get to be a dancer? And she said it was interesting. When she was at school, she was really hopeless. And the school in the 30s wrote to her parents and said, we think Gillian has a learning disorder. She couldn't concentrate, she was fidgeting. I think now they'd say she had ADHD. Wouldn't you? But this was the 1930s, and ADHD hadn't been invented, you know, at this point, so it wasn't an available condition. You know, people weren't aware they could have that. Anyway, she went to see this specialist. So this oak-panelled room, and she was there with her mother, and she was led and sat on this chair at the end, and she sat on her hands for 20 minutes while this man talked to her mother about all the problems Gillian was having at school. And at the end of it, because she was disturbing people, her homework was always late and so on, little kid of 8, in the end, the doctor went and sat next to Gillian and said, Gillian, I've listened to all these things that your mother's told me. I need to speak to her privately. So he said, wait here, we'll be back. We won't be very long. And they went and left her. But as they went out the room, he turned on the radio that was sitting on his desk. And when they got out the room, he said to her mother, just stand and watch her. And the minute they left the room, she said she was on her feet, moving to the music. And they watched for a few minutes, and he turned to her mother, and he said, you know, Mrs. Lynn, Gillian isn't sick, she's a dancer. Take her to a dance school. I said, what happened? He said, she did. I can't tell you how wonderful it was. We walked in this room, and it was full of people like me. People who couldn't sit still. People who had to move to think. Who had to move to think. They did ballet, they did tap, they did jazz, they did modern, they did contemporary. She was eventually auditioned for the Royal Ballet School. She became a soloist. She had a wonderful career at the Royal Ballet. She eventually graduated from the Royal Ballet School, found her own company, the Gillian Dance Company, met Andrew Lloyd Webber. She's been responsible for some of those successful musical theatre productions in history. She's given pleasure to millions, and she's a multi-millionaire. Somebody else might have put her on medication and told her to calm down.
the RSA has a new strapline, and that strapline is 21st century Enlightenment. And the original Enlightenment in the 18th century was not, of course, a single cohesive movement. It didn't have a simple start and finish. So when we think about the core ideals of the Enlightenment, it's not simply a kind of historical process. It's in a way, when we think about how those ideals have shaped modern values, norms, and lifestyles, it's a kind of process of cultural psychotherapy. We're delving into what has shaped the collective consciousness of modern people. And that enables us to explore critically whether those values and what they have come to mean to us still work for us, and whether they meet the challenges that we now face. So whilst I don't underestimate the ability of human beings to invent and to adapt, in the end, on balance, I do favour the view that we need to live differently in the 21st century. And as the architects of the Enlightenment understood, to live differently involves thinking differently. It involves seeing the world and ourselves from a new perspective. In critically examining what Enlightenment values have come to mean to us, what we can now bring to bear is powerful new insights into human nature. Insights that have emerged from a variety of scientific disciplines and social sciences over the last 20 or 30 years. Because Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton helped to lay the ground for the Enlightenment by revealing that the laws of nature not only failed to conform to religious doctrine, but also they failed to conform to intuition. So the Pope might have said the sun went round the earth. It might have felt like the sun went round the earth, but science showed otherwise. And I think that insights into human nature have a similar double impact, also unsettling our intuitive sense of ourself in the world. Most of our behavior, including social interaction, is the result of us responding automatically to the world around us, rather than the outcome of conscious decision-making. And in this sense, it's more realistic to see ourselves as integrally connected to the social and natural world, rather than as a separate, wholly autonomous entity. The research is clear. If you want to be a happier person, don't read a self-help book. Just have happier friends. And there are other lessons that we can learn from the more subtle and holistic model of human nature now emerging. We're not very good at making long-term decisions. We're much better understanding relative than absolute values. And as we found out in the credit crunch, we are enthralled to what Keynes called animal spirits. Perhaps even more startlingly, we are very, very bad at predicting what's going to make us happy. And we're even bad at describing what made us happy in the past. So I would argue that the moral and political critique of individualism now has an evidence base. And it's with this in mind that I argue that 21st century Enlightenment should champion a more self-aware, socially embedded model of autonomy that recognizes our frailties and limitations. Now, this does not mean repudiating the rights of the individual, and nor does it underestimate our unique ability to shape our own destinies. Indeed, it's actually by understanding that conscious thought is only a part of what drives our behavior that we become better able to exercise self-control. All of this can enable us to distinguish our needs from our appetites and our amazing human potential from the hubris of individualism. It's the basis for self-aware autonomy. The developmental psychologist Robert Kegan argues that successfully functioning in a society with diverse values, traditions, and lifestyles requires us, in his words, to have a relationship to our own reactions rather than be captive of them. I quote, "To resist our tendencies to make right or true that which is merely familiar, and wrong or false that which is only strange." Now, the good news, and it is really good news, is that there's every reason to believe that we can expand empathy's reach. Despite major departures from the trend, most terribly in the 20th century, the history of the human race has been one of diminishing person-to-person violence. Since the advent of modern civil rights, we've seen a revolution in social attitudes based on race, gender, sexuality. Furthermore, real-time global media have brought the suffering of distant people into our living rooms, and immigration, emigration, and foreign travel all provide us with opportunities to put ourselves in other people's shoes. There are reasons to ask whether the process of widening human empathy has stalled, and at just the time when we need it to accelerate. After 4 decades of post-war progress, levels of inequality have risen in the rich world. Tensions between different ethnic groups persist and have taken on new dimensions. Anti-immigrant sentiment has grown, arguably reflecting a failure by policymakers to balance the imperatives of globalization and the ideal of universalism with the empathic capacity of the communities most affected by change. From gangs to the impact of violent video games, there are worries about young people. Globalization and public deficits may mean that future generations in the West face tougher challenges than their parents. So the stock of global empathy upon which democratic leaders can draw has to grow if we're to reach agreements which put the long-term needs of the whole planet and all its people ahead of short-term national concerns. But the chain linking interpersonal, communal, and global-scale empathy is complex. Intellectuals, politicians, and interest groups, and think tanks spend an enormous amount of time debating what should be the content of universalism, which rights, which entitlements, which capabilities. But shouldn't we perhaps just spend a little more time exploring the foundations of universalist sentiment? What is it that enhances and what is it that diminishes our empathic capacity? The policy implications range from a continued emphasis on the early years of child rearing to developing schools as intelligent communities, to exploring the way popular culture inclines us to think of other people. For example, a culture which prized empathy would be one which distinguished the healthy activity of public disagreement from the unhealthy habit of public disparagement. It's become a cliche that education is the most valuable resource in a global knowledge economy. I would argue that fostering empathic capacity is just as important to achieving a world of citizens at peace with each other and with themselves. But even were we to have more self-aware and more empathic citizens, they would still face dilemmas and differences of opinion. I want to encourage us to recognize that the question, what is progress, raises substantive and ethical questions which we should be more willing to acknowledge, to honor, and to debate. How are we to make those decisions? Of course, the utilitarian answer lies in maximizing human happiness, and if progress is measured in these terms, we have done well since the Enlightenment, there is little doubt. The poorest citizens of the developed world now have better health, longer lifespans, and many more resources and opportunities than those who would have been considered well off a century ago. But sometimes it feels as though the idea that progress should be designed to increase happiness has turned into the assumption that pursuing progress is the same as improving human welfare. The success of the Western post-Enlightenment project has resulted in a society like ours being dominated by three logics: the logic of science and technological progress, the logic of markets, and the logic of bureaucracy. And the limits of the logic of science and of markets lie in their indifference to a substantive concern for the general good. If something can be discovered and developed, it should be discovered and developed. If something can be sold, then it should be sold. And the problem for bureaucracy is a tendency to put the rationality of rules above the rationality of ends. And so it's in this context that the 21st century Enlightenment project demands a reassertion of the fundamentally ethical dimension of humanism. How can we make it easier to ask, is this right? Is it to be a world where so many of us feel that the shape of our lives is dictated not by the ideal of a life fully lived, but by social convention and economic circumstance? Why should we cram education into the first quarter of our lives, desperately balance work and caring in the second and third quarter, and then feel that we're going to suffer second-class status and a fear of neglect in the final quarter? You see, rationality can tell us how best to get from A to Z, but without ethical reasoning, we cannot discuss where Z should be. So what we aim for can be as important to our well-being as what we achieve. As Michel Foucault says of Kant's own description of the Enlightenment, it has to be conceived as an attitude, an ethos, a philosophical life in which the critique of what we are is at one and the same time the historical analysis of the limits that are imposed on us and an experiment with the possibility of going beyond them. To be responsible, to create a big society, to live sustainably, this is not simply a matter of will. The 21st century Enlightenment calls for us to see past simplistic and inadequate ideas of freedom, of justice, and of progress. Perhaps it's time to stop chasing those myths, to stop being transfixed by abstractions, and instead to reconnect a concrete understanding of who we are as human beings, to political debates about who we need to be, and philosophical and even spiritual exploration of who we might aspire to be. Creative people who want to make a difference have 1,000,001 opportunities and distractions. To engage them means an ethic which is intolerant of negativity, rigid thinking, and self-promotion, and instead keeps people constantly in touch with the words of the anthropologist Margaret Mead. True to the spirit which created the Enlightenment, true to the spirit which moved the founders of the RSA 256 years ago, Margaret Mead said simply this: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has."
So what we have discovered in 30 years of research, there's 6 main time zones that people live in. 2 focus on the past, 2 on the present, and 2 on the future. The people who focus on the past either remember all the good old times, successes, happy birthdays, nostalgia. These are the people who keep the family record, the family books, who have the family rituals. There are other people who focus only on regret, only on failure, only on all the things that went wrong. So we call those focus past positive or past negative. There are 2 ways to be present-oriented. The most obvious is to be hedonistic, that you live for pleasure and you avoid pain. You seek novelty, you seek sensation. There are other people who are present-oriented because they say, it doesn't pay to plan. My life is fated. Fated by my religion, fated by my poverty, fated by the conditions that I'm living under. Most of us are here because we are future-oriented, that we have learned to work rather than play, to resist temptation. But there's another way to be future-oriented. Depending on your religion, life begins after the death of the mortal body. To be future-oriented, you have to trust that when you make a decision about the future, it's going to carry out. If you have great inflation, you don't put money in the bank because you can't trust the future. If there's instability in your family, adults can't keep their promises to you. The closer you are to the equator, the more present-oriented you are. The more you're in an environment where climate doesn't change, it gives you a set of imagining sameness rather than change. Protestants everywhere have higher gross national product than Catholic countries, in part because of the Protestant ethic, because of the notion that you work hard to succeed, to demonstrate that you are God's chosen people. My family comes from Sicily, and in Italy there is a political movement called La Liga to cut Italy in half, to have North Italy and South Italy, cut it just below Tuscany. The people in the North say, we do all the work. The people in the South are lazy. They're like children. They want to have babies, have 3-hour dinners, etc. People in the South say, they're not Italian, they're German and Austrian. You know. They eat yogurt instead of pasta. They take their lunch in a paper bag. And in the recent election, the Liga got 14% of the national vote. It turns out it is accurate. We've done research to say people in the North tend to be, on a scale, much more future-oriented. People in the South tend to be more past-oriented or present hedonistic. And so my family is Sicilian, and I come from Sicily. I go back every year. I started an educational foundation. We send high school kids to college and set up computer labs. And I'm talking about some of this stuff, and a man comes up and says, I'm a poet. I live with words. And it wasn't until I heard your talk that I realized there's no future tense verb in Sicilian dialect. I said, what do you mean? There was, is, there's no will be. He said, that's why nothing gets done. And I didn't realize it because we never planned. So again, here's how when you have a number of people who share a certain time perspective, then it does come to characterize a nation. The same way, if you have a Catholic nation where people tend to be present or past-oriented, rather than a Protestant nation where in general people tend to be more future-oriented, it affects you in very profound ways. So there's a wonderful book called The Geography of Time, and it's written by a dear friend of mine, Robert Levine, who's a social psychologist, and he actually literally went around the world doing wonderful experiments. He looks at what he calls the pace of life. See, time perspective is how people divide their own experience into partitions, time zones. Another kind of time orientation is your sense of duration. how much time has expired while you're sitting in a dentist's office before they start drilling? How much time has expired when you've been waiting in line? How much time has expired when you're having fun or at sex? So time duration is totally a function of whether you're bored, whether you're excited or not. And what he does is he shows that in different cultures, people have a different pace of life. And you do this very simply. You sit in a cafe and you mark off 100 meters, and as people pass, you start a stopwatch. And you see how fast people walk. You go to a post office, and on a piece of paper you say, I'd like, 3 pounds of this postage or 10 euros, and you see how long it takes. So he has a bunch of these measures, and it turns out you can identify cultures as different pace of life, and now cities. And he shows in America, you can rank 60 cities according high pace of life and low pace of life. And the ones that have the highest pace of life, men have the most coronary problems. That is, this becomes part of your whole way of life. We all begin life as present hedonists. All of us. I mean, at the breast, at the bottle, we want pleasure, we want to avoid pain. And one of the things that families do, and especially school, my sense is the purpose of schooling is to take present-oriented little beasts and make them more future-oriented. In some cultures, make them more past-oriented. In America, a child drops out of school every 9 seconds. This is worse for kids from a minority background, and it's worse for boys than girls. There's actually a disaster recipe developing among boys in America, literally dropping out of high school, college, and it's not simply poor performance. One of the problems is, a recent study shows that by the time a boy is 21, he has spent at least 10,000 hours playing video games alone. Probably more watching pornography alone. And you put that together, it means, A, they haven't learned social skills, emotional, social intelligence, but also it means that they live in a world that they create. They're playing Warcraft, they're playing these other games, which is exciting. In fact, I just heard the other day that these game companies are now going to develop 3D games so that the world will be all around you. Their brains are being digitally rewired, which means they will never fit in a traditional classroom, which is analog. Somebody talks at you without even the nice pictures, meaning it's boring. I mean, you control nothing. You sit there passively. And if you want to change the curriculum, I understand the traditionalists here say we got to go back to reading, writing, arithmetic. Disaster. These kids will never fit into that. They have to be in a situation where they are controlling something, and school is set up, you control nothing. You're passive. School is all about learning, delay of gratification, literally endlessly. All addictions are addictions of present hedonism. Food, sex, drugs, gambling, etc. All of our propaganda, all of our educational message, all our public relations messages are designed for future-oriented kids, who's not the problem. They tell you, here's the negative consequences of doing what you're doing. Future-oriented kids know that, and they don't do it. Present-oriented kids know the future consequences. If you're a teenage girl, you know that if you have unprotected sex, you're likely to get pregnant or have sexually transmitted disease. You know it, but that knowledge never feeds back to change your behavior. So that's the interesting thing about time perspective. I think we are underestimating the power of technology in rewiring young people's brains. Kids don't wear wristwatches. They say it's a single function device. You don't waste time with a single function device. And they live in a digital thing. What matters is the second. I didn't mention one of the things that gets people upset in America is how long it takes to boot up your computer and how long it takes to download something. Less than a minute. That makes people angry. So it becomes an emotional thing. You get angry waiting in line, waiting for services. Waiting is a waste of time, even if it's waiting for your computer to boot up. So I think there's a fundamental change going on in our culture that I think we adults are not realizing, that kids are totally different than we were. And it's because it's revolution in time. There was a recent study we did with USA Today, asking Americans how busy they are. The vast majority of Americans, more than 50%, said, I'm busier now than I was last year, I'm busier last year than the previous year, and I sacrifice friends, family, and sleep for my success. This is across the board, not separating by future orientation. And then we say, suppose you had an 8-day a week, what would you do? They say, oh, that would be great. they would spend most of that time working harder, achieving more, not with friends, not with family, and not even sleeping. They did a study 20 years ago, and I was upset, again, from this Italian background. Only 60% of Americans said they have regular sit-down family dinners. When we redid the study last year, only 1 in 5 American families have sit-down dinners together. In America, we talk about family values. You can't have a family value if you never have family meals together. I think many of life's puzzles can be solved by simply understanding our own time perspective and that of others. Lots of conflict we have with people is really a conflict in different time perspectives. Once you're aware of that, you stop making negative attributions like you're dumb or you're childish or you're pig-headed or you're authoritarian. It's really the most simple idea in the world.